We recorded this conversation on Friday, October 13th. It was less than a week after the horrific terrorist attack on Israel. Since then, the humanitarian crisis in that region continues to escalate. We know we can't predict the state of world events whenever it is that you're listening to this show. But what we will always be committed to is doing our best to lead with compassion.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, and if you hear an echo, it's because I'm in quarantine in an echoey room.
And I'm Jason Rosoff.
I'm Amy Sandler. Quarantine is it a state of mind, a place, a location?
It is my garage.
I'm Brandy Neal. Are you sleeping in the garage, Kim?
I am allowed outside, but not into the rest of the house.
You have a bedroom and a bathroom in there?
There is a bed, actually, which Jason recently used.
It's lovely.
Yeah, not with me, obviously, with Jillian. And this was before I got COVID.
Yes.
And there is a bathroom right in the room right next to this. So I'll hold my breath and go into that room and close the door and use the bathroom and then hold my breath and run back into the garage and stay here. That's what I'm doing.
If I was going to have to quarantine, it really wouldn't be a bad spot.
Yeah, you're right. I'm making it sound bad. My garage is a lovely place to work.
Yep.
And since you can't see, there's the beautiful orange, yellow, purple shelves. Kim, are those even the right descriptors of the color? I'm sure they have like fancy names.
Yeah, no, I think it's orange, yellow, and it's kind of, I wish it were purple. It's maroon.
It's a little maroon, yeah. Recently featured in the New York Times, Kim's beautiful room.
Bookshelves.
Yes, actually, that's true. We can put that in the show notes if you want to see these shelves. Kim, Jason, it's Friday, October 13th, 2023. We wanted to get together and have a conversation about what's happening in the world, how we are each feeling, and in the spirit of seeing how we might be able to be helpful for our listeners.
Yeah, and what is happening in the world is that violence is erupting in Israel and Gaza, and we have struggled as a team to figure out how to respond, what, if anything, to say.
Yes, and I think the hard part for me as a person who bears a Jewish name and is of Jewish heritage, like it's very complicated to figure out even how I feel, let alone what I should do. I feel like Amy and I had a good conversation earlier in the week, and what I realized was I had some protective hesitation at the beginning of the week in like even looking at what was going on. And I've been reflecting on it the last few days, and I think there are many people who must be feeling similarly of just that there's a paralysis, like a feeling of being stunned, and not stunned in like the surprise way, but stunned in the like immobile.
Yeah.
Like it feels like I had the sense knocked out of me. You know what I'm saying? Like if you've ever fallen and hit your head really bad and like nothing quite makes sense anymore, that's what it feels like.
And Jason, just for folks who might not understand protective hesitation, can you explain what that means?
It's a term that usually applies to failing to give feedback because you're worried about offending the other person. I was feeling it toward myself. Like I was feeling afraid of like engaging too deeply for fear of like traumatizing myself. Like that was my fear. Like the closer that I looked at this, the more traumatic it was going to be. And between being sick at the beginning of the week and feeling like I there's like other things that needed to happen this week. We've had a lot going on like at the company and stuff like that. I was like, I don't think I have it. I don't think I have the capacity to like really engage with this. And what was interesting to me is it was only upon reflection that I realized that I was behaving in that way. I didn't consciously realize I was protecting myself. I was only like in retrospect looking at my behavior and being like, oh, I'm behaving differently than I think I normally would.
And Amy, how has, if you're comfortable speaking about it, how has this week felt for you?
I mean, that is a really, that is the big question. The how comfortable I feel speaking about it, and the reason, and I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of safety. Certainly we talk a lot about psychological safety in the workplace, and what we have seen is just a complete lack of safety, physical safety, bodily safety, moral safety, with just such violence. And so on the one hand, thousands and thousands of miles away, feeling very safe. On the other hand, I would say the journey of the week has been very much about sort of that stunned feeling of what Jason said. And with the first acts on Saturday, October 7th, and then reaching out to other Jewish friends. And I would say that I am a child of 2 Jewish parents and Jewish ancestry. I am spiritual, not religious, but very proud of my heritage. And it's in my, it's in my DNA. It's also in sort of the stories of my upbringing. And so I think what really started was on Monday and talking to a friend whose mother had been a Holocaust survivor, and he was very traumatized. And then starting to connect with other friends who were aware that people at work weren't talking about it. And this sort of unfolding of stunned and silence and shock. And what I found was that it was in the sort of one-on-one conversations, the small conversations, where I felt most supported and heard, and I felt really motivated to reach out to to connect with other people. Because, when we lead a workshop, we might have a large group, and then we put people into breakout groups, and they might feel more safe in those small groups. And then those same people that might be talking amongst 2 or 3 people are maybe not going to feel as safe in the large group. And that's been really on my mind, because things that I might feel or say or that would be helpful for me could in fact unintentionally be very harmful for someone else. And as someone who cares deeply about suffering for all people, for all innocent children and families everywhere, the idea that me processing my own experience might in some way harm someone else gives me a lot of pause. And so I think what I'm holding is, how can I kind of honor my own experience, honor the stand against the evil of taking innocent life, and also hold the worry of what's coming ahead, and how to find places that feel safe to share in a way that will be helpful and not hurtful.
Amy, I don't know if you've told Kim and Jason about your personal connection to Israel.
I will say a family relative who I had reached out to, he spent much of his life in Israel, and he was sharing how it brought back 50 years ago when his wife was wheeling their baby on Yom Kippur, and he was a physician in what was then a civilian hospital that then became a hospital where he had to manage military wounds from the attack 50 years ago. And so just, I think what emerges for me is that I come from, in this moment, safety, privilege, socioeconomic opportunity, and yet knowing that there's all this other sort of ancestral and kind of tribal trauma that this does bring up.
Yeah, I think the complexity of your experience, that one, I think you've done a great job of like, and I know it's taken quite some time for you to process these things, but you've done a good job of sort of like piecing apart the different parts of your experience. And I think for a lot of people, it just feels like, I don't know, for listeners who have ever been to an ocean, who have been knocked over by a wave, and the disorientation that happens when you're underwater and the wave is sort of over your head, I think that's how it feels for a lot of people. They can't pick apart the bubbles,
and you don't know which way is up.
Correct. They don't know. And you've quite beautifully in what you said, like sort of identified some of those bubbles. You know what I'm saying? You said, like, I see this is like, my ethnic heritage here and my familial, experiences here. And, my personal current experience of like the place I live and the experience that I have as an individual, and like piecing those things apart and realizing that there's tension between those, and a feeling. And what I took away from what you said overall was the sense of obligation that you feel to do that work so that you can do something of value with the feeling that you have. And I think that's like, for a lot of people, the disorientation leads immediately to anger. There's no, you know what I'm saying? That's because we don't learn to do this. We don't learn to see the bubbles and identify them and figure out which way is up. Like that's a honed skill. And so I'm offering you some public praise at your ability to do that and then to speak about it so clearly.
Yeah, well, thank you both for being willing to share, because I think there's also almost like a generational trauma. That is present for both of you, that I want to acknowledge is not necessarily present for me, in that I'm not Jewish, and yet I have enormous compassion. I dated a Holocaust survivor for a long time, and so I feel the pain, and at the same time, recently I've been coaching a group of entrepreneurs in Gaza, and I have a great deal of compassion there, and that made it really difficult. I felt like there was a lot of pressure as a writer and as a leader to say something publicly. Mm-hmm. And I sort of got angry about it, actually, because I felt like there was nothing I could say that wasn't going to hurt somebody. Mm-hmm. And all I wanted to do was provide comfort in the moment. And I really wrestled with it for several days. And finally, I thought about sort of how I felt when a relative called me right after 9/11, when I was living in Manhattan, and started to rather, before she even checked in on how I was doing and how I was feeling. And someone close to me I had just found out they had died in the plane that crashed into the Pentagon, and this person who I really love, actually, started in on a critique of U.S. policy. And it was so hurtful that intellectually, I didn't even necessarily disagree with her, but emotionally, it just felt so horrible. And I realized that there was pressure on me to make policy proclamations that I just don't feel like I have standing to make. And so I tried to write something that was compassionate without, but it's very difficult to do that without sounding both sidesy, or, mm-hmm. It's like a real, and I think leaders are being called upon to make these kinds of proclamations in a way that's not really helpful. Like I felt like I could spend a ton of time working on it and have no impact. Mm-hmm. And it's not that I don't care, but I want to, we only have so much. All I have really is time. That's what I've got in this life. And so I want to make sure that if I'm going to spend time on something, it has impact. I don't want to waste it. And so that's kind of what was going on for me.
Yeah. And, and we can put that in the show notes. If we
put
publish
what I wrote.
This. Yeah. And I will just say, I just was so touched by what you wrote, and also the process that we went through of, my background was in executive communications and being responsible for crafting those types of more formal responses. And at a university when that needs to speak for free speech and for liberal ideas and for holding every member of a community with compassion, whatever the differences and the diversity. And what I so loved, Kim, about how you landed on what you shared, it just felt so connected to who you are. And you shared how, in a time like this of so much violence and trauma, that it's the care personally that matters most. It's the compassion. We might intellectually agree with anger at governments and actions that we find unjust. I think for me, when I look at the statements that resonated most in yours, it was sharing the personal story. It was optimizing for compassion. When I've looked at other statements, I think it is incumbent on a leader to speak against evil, to speak for humanity, to speak for seeing all people as worthy, as intrinsic humans, as to speak for life and the sacredness of that, regardless of your ethnicity or what side of a border you're on. So I think speaking up against violence, speaking up against dehumanizing, speaking up against anti-Semitism, against Islamophobia, like all of those things, I think are things that leaders can do. I also think that leaders can do what we have been doing, which are these like one-on-one conversations to understand what care personally looks like for the people that we're close to.
Yeah, I think you're exactly. I think that's really beautifully said, Amy. I mean, I think like part of what is this moment where we are in history is that there's so much broadcasting and there's not enough one-on-one conversation. And I guess what I was saying is the more one-on-one conversations we have, I think that's what has much more impact than sometimes it feels like screaming into the void when you tweet or post. And so that's I think that was sort of where I came down is what I can the best use of my time is to pick up the phone and call people who I know and who I care about and ask how I can support them.
Jason, I'm curious your own thoughts on the leadership part of this, which is that how to create a space for people at work to feel supported, to feel seen, to acknowledge that there is real suffering going on and there's going to be likely even more suffering. What role does a leader have in sort of creating opportunities for those conversations in the workplace?
I mean, I think one thing is just acknowledging that the suffering exists. I think one of the problems that we've observed is that in the paralysis that people have felt, part of what has happened is that they haven't taken these private actions, meaning they haven't reached out to people and said, I know this is going on. I know it could be causing suffering, and I want you to know that I'm here for you. And I'm open to talking if you want to talk, or not talking if you don't want to talk, but I'm here. Like I'm offering my support. So I think there's like a basic level of acknowledging suffering. I think there's like a thing that happens, which is in the workplace, there's often a temptation to figure out, is there an efficient way for us to deal with all of this suffering? And that's where the statements come in. You know what I'm saying? Like the statements are seen as like an efficiency tool to like set the stage for these things. The problem is not all people are suffering from the same thing. And like lumping, and I think the harm that you both were describing comes from trying to describe all the suffering, which you will inevitably miss some of it. You're going to mistake some of it. You're going to overemphasize some and underemphasize other suffering. And instead of saying like the events of this week, have been horribly painful for so many people. And I want you to know that I, like as a human being, I am available to you if you want to talk about it. To my mind, it might seem inefficient, but it's a far better approach to take. And if you're not directly, meaning if you're not feeling traumatized by it, you also have an opportunity to learn more about what people inside your company are experiencing. Like sometimes the leader is also, like I also noticed that there were many people in leadership positions who were feeling that pain. It was like they were feeling some level of direct pain themselves. And so maybe they couldn't hold that space. And so I think the other obligation of leaders is to look around and to say, maybe I would normally, lean on our CEO to lead this, but can I pick up some of that slack? Can I be the one who's like taking on some of this communication because he or she or they are feeling particularly vulnerable or harmed in this moment? But I would say like the temptation to try to deal with these things efficiently is only going to is going to perpetuate harm and trauma. Like the care personally is the thing that matters, and there's not always an efficient way to show that you care.
Yeah, and honestly, relationships are not efficient. Like,
right. You say this all the time.
And that's one of the wonderful things about relationships. Like, efficiency is absolutely the wrong measure of a relationship. I think that it's one-on-one. You can only have so many of them, and they're, I think, the most wonderful thing in life. But if you try to measure them in terms of efficiency or try to scale like human beings don't scale and relationships don't scale, we shouldn't try to make them scale because then they're no longer relationships. I mean, AI scales. I do not.
Yeah.
And I will say that when I look at sort of what's gotten me through this week has been these just really heart-opening one-on-one conversations, and it's motivated me to check in on a lot of people. And there is a lot of suffering and not, to sort of what we were talking about earlier, not being able to even identify all the pieces. I'm curious, Kim, you felt the frustration as a writer and sort of a public figure of needing to maybe put something on the page. As a leader, it's a very small team, so you actually are able to have one-on-one conversations with us. If you were at Google or at Apple or one of your previous roles, like how would you be thinking about that, or how would you advise folks who are in large organizations if people are feeling that silence is maybe landing in a way that my suffering isn't being seen?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think as a leader, you're responsible for everyone's suffering on your team. And often people are suffering in different ways and for different reasons. They're suffering on opposite sides of this conflict. And I think that is very difficult for a leader. And then there's pressure, I think, on leaders to make policy statements almost. And leaders, CEOs are CEOs. They are not in the State Department. And they're not necessarily qualified to make policy statements. So I think that the important thing is to focus on compassion for the people who work for you and to figure out also how to help people work together. So, for example, and then there's also another issue that I sort of struggled with. Like when Russia invaded Ukraine, I spent a lot of time on that, in part because of my personal connection to both places, and also because of the fact that I studied the risk of all-out nuclear war, which is something that has obsessed me since I was 18, and so, and at the same time, I was aware then, as I am aware now, that I was not spending nearly as much time or mental energy thinking about the violence that is happening in Africa right now, for example. And that feels wrong to me. And so how leaders can reconcile all these different things. Like it feels, I think, a little bit like if you make public proclamations about certain atrocities and not others, then that feels wrong. And if you make public proclamations about all atrocities, you're spending a lot of time making public proclamations about atrocities. And I don't know what I would love to get your guidance, Amy, because I don't know what the answer is, but it feels a little bit like, from a leader's perspective, that it's really hard to get this right. It's impossible, in fact, to get this right. Which is not to say that's a reason to do nothing. But the question is, how can leaders focus on the things where they can have the most impact? Because leaders pretending to work at the State Department doesn't really help anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't have any answers. What has been coming up a lot for me is my favorite quote of Albert Einstein, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And when I look at just, on a day when I just am feeling there's just even more suffering and pain ahead and heartbreak in Gaza after the heartbreak in Israel, and I just feel so almost overwhelmed by it, that I feel like for me, what I'm focusing on is, after having kind of managed my own emotional process and acknowledging that, is how can I help? And to your point, how can I be most helpful? And how can I focus on sort of the world that I want to see of compassion and of bringing in everyone's voice? And one way that I think that I like to do that is through, and Kim, we talked recently about stories, but is through poetry. And I was reading this morning, I had participated in a poetry workshop last year with Naomi Shihab Nye, who's a famous and I believe Palestinian American poet who really speaks to Arab American experience. And it's this beautiful poem. And I don't know if it's helpful for me to read it, but
Please read it. Yeah.
I will hope to do it justice. We can certainly, I'd much rather have it in her words, but it's called Gate A4. Wandering around the Albuquerque airport terminal after learning my flight had been delayed 4 hours, I heard an announcement. If anyone in the vicinity of Gate A4 understands any Arabic, please come to the gate immediately. Well, one pauses these days. Gate A4 was my own gate. I went there. An older woman in full traditional Palestinian embroidered dress, just like my grandma wore, was crumpled to the floor, wailing. "Help," said the flight agent. "Talk to her. What is her problem?" We told her the flight was going to be late, and she did this. I stooped to put my arm around the woman and spoke haltingly. "Shu dawa, shu bidak habiti, stani shwe min fadlik, shubit sui." The minute she heard any words she knew, however poorly used, she stopped crying. She thought the flight had been canceled entirely. She needed to be in El Paso for major medical treatment the next day. I said, "No, we're fine. You'll get there just later. Who's picking you up? Let's call him." We called her son. I spoke with him in English. I told him I would stay with his mother till we got on the plane and ride next to her. She talked to him. Then we called her other sons, just for the fun of it. Then we called my dad, and he and she spoke for a while in Arabic and found out, of course, they had 10 shared friends. Then I thought, just for the heck of it, why not call some Palestinian poets I know and let them chat with her? This all took up 2 hours. She was laughing a lot by then, telling of her life, patting my knee, answering questions. She had pulled a sack of homemade mamoul cookies, little powdered sugar crumbly mounds stuffed with dates and nuts, from her bag, and was offering them to all the women at the gate. To my amazement, not a single woman declined one. It was like a sacrament. The traveler from Argentina, the mom from California, the lovely woman from Laredo. We were all covered with the same powdered sugar and smiling. There is no better cookie. And then the airline broke out free apple juice from huge coolers, and 2 little girls from our flight ran around serving it. And they were covered with powdered sugar too. And I noticed my new best friend, by now we were holding hands, had a potted plant poking out of her bag, some medicinal thing with green furry leaves. Such an old country tradition. Always carry a plant, always stay rooted to somewhere. And I looked around that gate of late and weary ones, and I thought, this is the world I want to live in. The shared world. Not a single person in that gate, once the crying of confusion stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies. I wanted to hug all those other women too. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost.
I think you did it justice. Before you started to read, and both Amy and Kim are feeling quite emotional, so we're going to give them a second. But before you started to read that, I was thinking, in the face of immense suffering, like the greatest protest is to validate the humanity of everyone around you. And I think without knowing the content of the poem did such a beautiful job of describing just such a situation, right? Like the validation of the humanity of all of those people. And I think that's why it's so important to my mind to like spend time in community with others in moments of suffering, to truly validate them and to treat each of them as precious. Yeah, I'm going to think about that poem. I think that's one of those things where maybe not the exact words, but the emotion of that moment and that sense of possibility is something that's going to stick with me for a long time.
And such a simple thing, It shouldn't be too much to ask.
Yeah.